We're going to think about this next section of 1 Peter and also thinking about kind of a preaching question in terms of preaching complex passages. And so if you've looked ahead, if you know 1 Peter, you know we're coming to the little bit in this book that is a bit challenging in terms of, okay, what does he actually mean? And there's a few. I remember taking a course at seminary. I forget what it was called, something like Critical New Testament Interpretation or something, but the teacher had 20 passages that were challenging, and this was definitely one of them. I don't think it was the most challenging, but it was up there. And we had to kind of pick a passage and then work on it and produce our final paper for the course. This wasn't mine. And actually, I'm happy for us to look at it, and we're going to walk our way through the section briefly. But really, I want to put our focus on a preaching issue as a group of preachers and Bible teachers and communicators. What do we do when it comes time to preach and we're not certain of how to explain a passage? And so because I want us to spend some time thinking about that, I'm not going to try to get us to a definitive conclusion about the challenges in this section. And that's not me copping out. I've got a fairly strong view of what I think the right explanation is. But if all I do is convince you of my position, I feel like we've wasted our time, because you could read that in a book. What we can do uniquely here at ELF in this network is talk about the preaching side of things. What do we do when we find ourselves preparing a sermon and we're in 1 Peter 3, or we're in 1 Timothy 2, or James 5, or 1 John 5, or wherever the tricky sections are, 1 Corinthians 14, there's a lot of them that people kind of hesitate over and are not certain what to do with. What do we do if we cannot get to a place of certainty? Even if you can feel very confident in your own view, but you're still not certain you want to preach it as being definite. You see what I mean? Like, what do we do with that? So that's kind of where we're going to go. So if we take the first part to walk through this text, and we'll have a few comments along the way. And I'd like to keep in mind kind of the questions we were asking yesterday in the first session. How is Peter encouraging and caring for people that are facing challenging times? I want us to keep our radar beeping for that, so that we don't just switch into sort of academic mode and start thinking, oh, this is complicated, and then forget people. I want us to keep thinking about preaching to people that are suffering. We'll work our way through it, and then we'll think about, okay, so what do you do when your passage, even after some work, is not certainly clear in its in terms of how you are exegeting it? Okay, so that's kind of where we're going. So let's jump in. So we're starting at verse 13 here. Just going to go through this in 4 chunks. Okay, so suffer for the right reasons is the title I've given it. Not really worried about that. Let's just look at the text and make a few quick comments and keep moving. Now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. Okay, so a few quick comments. In light of yesterday, the whole section, the submission sections that Andy was leading you through as well, what do you see Peter doing here? What would you want us to notice just in our conversation? Yeah, let's move on. There's so much we could say here, but that's really good stuff. So then he moves from them suffering and ultimately being vindicated to Christ suffering and being vindicated. So we've had this before in terms of chapter 2, where he's talking about submission. gets to, was it verse 22, talks about Christ also submitted, entrusting himself to him who judges justly, the sort of suffering, submitting in silence kind of thing. Christ as the example in the midst of the instruction. Well, here we've got kind of the same sort of thing. Christ has also suffered for the right reasons, not for doing evil, of course. But what he says gives us some challenges. So here's the passage. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him. Now, that is 5 verses that if you read them and you're not scheduled to preach them, you probably breathe a sigh of relief, right? Because that is complex, right? So what are the complexities here? Like, without explaining them, what are the challenges for us? A couple of comments here. Here's Martin Luther. He says, this is a strange text and certainly a more obscure passage than any other passage in the New Testament. I still do not know for sure what the apostle meant. Okay, so there's permission for us to not have a definitive answer. Unless, of course, you think Luther wasn't very biblical, then pressure's on you to have a definitive answer. I think just a very simplistic kind of way of thinking about this, or just alerting us to some of the issues. So first of all, baptism and salvation. Baptism, which now saves you. I think to me, it's worth noticing that he seems to immediately clarify what he means. So when I've preached this, that first phrase that I've circled there, baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, that sounds like you get saved by being baptized, but he immediately goes on to say, not a removal of dirt from the body, but an appeal to God for a good conscience. This is not that the thing itself is doing something, it's not like a super spiritual cleansing. It's a recognition of something spiritual that's taking place. And so I think that one actually is not that difficult when you're preaching to just clarify for people straight away. Peter himself does not seem to be saying that we're saved through baptism. He's saying baptism is a picture of a spiritual reality, which is this appeal to God for a good conscience. So you have to explain that. But that one, okay. The earlier stuff about preaching, spirit, prison, all of that stuff, there's a variety of potential kind of explanations for it. And like I said, I'll just mention them, but you can go and read commentaries and see what people think and, come to your own conclusion. So there's the kind of at the cross or after the cross element. So it's either, probably a minor view is that the proclamation happens on the cross. Others would say, no, it's after the cross in terms of Jesus descending into hell to proclaim. Others would say it's somewhere between the cross and the resurrection. That there's somewhere in that sequence, there's a proclamation that was taking place. And then the proclamation is either to humans or to fallen angels or to angels. And so you've got this complexity there. Is it a declaration to the heavenly realms? Is it a declaration to imprisoned, contained fallen angels? Is it a declaration to humans? Is it a declaration that it has an implicit invitation? So is Jesus somehow preaching to souls in hell, inviting them to salvation? Is he merely proclaiming victory but not offering anything, just a declaration down there? Does the Bible really support the fact that Jesus went to hell from the cross? That's a statement in a creed, but does the text really support it? If it does, this one is a key one for it. But there's lots of questions around that, and so you got some confusion there. Or there's the other option, which is that it's actually looking way back, so that Christ in the Spirit through Noah preached formerly to people that were disobedient and are now imprisoned. And so kind of a Christ in the Old Testament sort of an idea, kind of like chapter 1, the Spirit preaching, Spirit of Christ preaching through the prophets. Is it kind of referring to that? So there's a whole kind of set of options, but I don't really want us to spend the time that we have wrestling with it. You may have a strong opinion and you may be right. You may have a strong opinion and you may be wrong. You may not know yet, and you can also research it. But for the sake of what we're doing, I just wanted to kind of flag the potentials and then say, wrestle with it, look at it, see what the text is doing. You'll find, if you're using the English Bible, that the New American Standard, which is kind of up there with trusted translations, is slightly different from the ESV, and that one helps that before the flood kind of an interpretation seem more possible, more likely. So that's something to be aware of as well. Now, let's just keep moving for now, because we want to see the whole section. Okay, so he really continues with some of those thoughts at the start of chapter 4, where he's talking about living out Christ's victory in an unbelieving world. Let me read this to you, and then you can make some comments and observations. Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of time, the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you. But they will give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is why the gospel was preached, even to those who are dead, that though judged in the flesh the way people are, they might live in the spirit the way God does. And I think we've all tasted that a little bit, haven't we? That even in a small way, sometimes something happens, even not to us, there's something on the news or a disaster or pandemic or whatever, something happens and it draws our motivations away from other things to family or to God or to prayer or to something, and other things that were so enticing suddenly have got no grip on us, and that suffering can actually be, in that sense, a real blessing, even though it's hard. And then don't want to miss as well verse 6. 6 is the bit that kind of makes us go back to the previous paragraph, isn't it? But the language here in verse 6 does seem to be saying that the gospel led to some people living differently, being judged humanly, but now living spiritually forever. It's that perspective shift from, oh, but if I don't join in, I'm going to suffer for it. Temporarily, that may be true, but long term, what does it mean to live in the spirit the way God does? And so there's a lot going on there. Let's go to the last one, just to kind of complete our walkthrough here. Live out Christ's victory in the church. I'm not saying these are great titles, but these are the outline we're using. So verse 7, the end of all things is at hand. Therefore, be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. Above all, keep loving one another earnestly. We saw that in chapter 1, verse 22, same word here. Loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Whoever speaks, as one who speaks the oracles of God. Whoever serves, as one who serves by the strength that God supplies, in order that in everything God may be glorified through Jesus Christ. To him belong glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. There's kind of the ground we've covered. All right, we've covered it briefly, and I understand that you might be wishing we could spend an hour and 15 minutes really wrestling with every detail, but for the reasons that I've said already, we're not going to do that. But you get a feel for that, right? Just as in terms of how 1 Peter's working, he's started celebrating salvation at the start of the book, moves on to deal with some of those submission issues that you saw yesterday. Now he's getting into the suffering. It feels like he's building towards that, right? That the suffering is really what he wants to address. And so laid a foundation with salvation, address some of the complexities of submission, and now get into the suffering issues. And yet all the way through, it seems to me there's a tone that is pastoral, that is sensitive. He's not writing a treatise on suffering as if it's a theory. He's writing to people that he wants to handle it well and to deal with it well. Okay, so thinking in terms of this passage as a whole, that's quite a long section, but it could easily be that you're preaching through this and that's actually 4 weeks worth of sermons, or 2. It'd be very straightforward to just kind of do them in 2, or to do it as 4. Whether you're moving quickly or carefully through this, at some point, in some way, you've got to deal with that part. Right? And that we're going to kind of take as our case study in complexity. If Martin Luther still doesn't understand it, I presume his quote wasn't from after he went to heaven, so he may now actually understand it. But at the point where he wrote that, he didn't. So accepting that some of us aren't quite as brilliant as Luther, what do we do when we get passages that are complicated, difficult? Okay, so just a few thoughts for us, and then I want us to I'll just throw some things at us, and then we'll discuss together, and then we'll actually go back and look for a few minutes at some of those paragraphs and think about preaching them with a specific question in mind. But it seems to me that if we're going to be preaching challenging sections, the underlying issue is, are we going to be biblically accurate? And I think if we're not committed to being biblically accurate in our ministry, we'll tend to just skirt round them or give superficial explanations anyway. Okay, so I think we shouldn't give up on our prior commitment to being as biblically accurate as we can possibly be, even when it's difficult, right? It's not, we don't have commitments and convictions for the sake of 80% of Bible passages. We have them for 100%, all right? We want to do our best. We want to be as biblical as we possibly can be. And that's what's going to create some of the tensions for us. Now, equally, that may mean that at times we need to say to people, I'm honestly not sure how to interpret this. And I think there's a value in that, because what's the alternative? We can skirt around it and avoid it, and people watching carefully might think, why is the preacher avoiding that section? It looks complicated. You know, is there a lack of integrity? So that's not a good thing. But also, if we give almost like I don't want to say flippant, but if we give an explanation that we're not convinced of and that isn't convincing, our listeners may feel like, well, what is it we're communicating? Are we communicating that the Bible is there to serve us as preachers, and therefore for them as listeners, they can just make of it what they will? You know, just kind of make up interpretations and be satisfied. Whereas actually, if we say, I really want to understand what I'm reading, I'm just not clear exactly what this means. It could be this, or it could be this. I'm not certain. Does that actually communicate to people, oh, that implies you are more certain of everything else, and it is possible to be certain, with appropriate humility. So I think actually that may be a message we do want to communicate to the people we're preaching to. I'd far rather they think I'm supposed to understand the Bible as best I can, rather than they think, wow, Peter Mead understands everything. You see what I mean? I'd rather they have a conviction about Scripture than a conviction about my knowledge, because that's really not important in most senses. Okay, so I think it's worth kind of wrestling with this, because we want our listeners to be Bible readers who are trying to make sense of what they read, who even believe it means something. And I think we need to see that increasingly we're living in a culture now where everything is subjective. My wife has been doing a Bible, kind of sharing Bible highlights and notes with a friend for several years, and her friend still ultimately doesn't accept that the Bible actually means something. She enjoys it, she appreciates it, but she still keeps coming back to my truth, your truth, and so my wife is kind of working with her and praying for her, trying to get her to realize we're not looking at modern art where we can bring our own meaning to it. It's a message from God that needs to be understood and submitted to. And it's a slow process, but it's kind of an exciting one to watch and pray for. But we've got a lot of people like that, shaped by our culture, who they can read this passage and say, well, to me it means, and they instant understanding, but actually no understanding. And so we can model for them that actually it takes some wrestling, right? It's not, every passage is not immediately obvious, but we have to wrestle with it, because we're not the ones responsible to come up with a meaning. We're the ones that are being invited to wrestle and discover the meaning. Okay, so I think that's in there. At the same time, I think we need to be aware pastorally that we can very easily switch. And I think I don't want to be gender specific and get myself cancelled from ELF or something, but I think men in particular, male preachers, can have a tendency to switch from pastoral mode to academic mode. We can sort of change compartments in our mind, and we can suddenly find ourselves giving a interpretational exegetical essay from the pulpit. There are three main interpretations of this passage. The evidence for the first one is this, the evidence for the second is this, the evidence for the third is that. I would eliminate the evidence for the third because it seems weak to me, so it's got to be one or two. And we can go into this sort of logical mode that works in Bible school, but actually does nothing for our listeners. If they're sat there suffering and they've listened to verses, I mean, suffering in life, not through your sermon, but they're suffering and they're struggling and they're finding chapter 3 verses, 13 to 17 really helpful. And then 18 to 22 suddenly becomes this mental exercise that has no relation to their suffering. That seems like a real shame, because Peter was writing that to suffering people. And in his mind, it was addressing the issue of suffering. It was not going away from it. Do you see what I mean? So it's not that he says, all right, enough about your circumstances. Let me give you some Bible trivia and some theological, complexity just to show off because I'm an apostle. He doesn't do that. He's using Christ as an example to reinforce the pastoral message that he's giving. And so somehow as we communicate it, we need to communicate the tone, even if we do not have the ability to give a definitive interpretation. Right? So we want to keep the tone of the context, both written and our listeners, in view as we do that. There is a place for indefinite exegesis. When we don't know, it's better to say that than to just toss a coin and go with one option with certainty. That doesn't help people. Now, how you communicate that, I can think of several options. One option is to make your big emphasis 3 verses 13 to 17, and then just mention there's a bit at the end that's more complicated. It's actually quite difficult to understand, but what we do know is that he's trying to use Christ as an example to encourage them in the midst of their suffering. So you can almost avoid it, but just be honest that it's difficult. Or you can be preaching verses 13 to 17 and then go to this and say, this is complicated. Let me tell you some of the options, or the main options. And you could give a simplified explanation of 2, maybe 3 options, and say, honestly, I'm not sure, but actually, whichever one it is, his point pastorally is coming through here. And you can reinforce the pastoral point while leaving it indefinite. Or you can present 2 or 3 views, a little bit of evidence for each, and you can say, personally, I think my feeling is it probably is number 3, but I wouldn't be certain about that. And if you think number 1 or number 2, that's okay. We don't need to fall out over it, because actually, the point of what Peter's saying here is clear pastorally, even if it's not clear in detail. So there's different ways you can go about it. The one thing I would suggest we don't do is make it so big of a thing that we lose the pastoral part. Because if people want to get an hour-long lecture on the interpretation of 1 Peter 3, they are welcome to go to seminary, learn Greek, and do all the years and get to that lecture. It's possible to do that. I don't think the church is necessarily the place to do that. It may be in conversation with you afterwards, that somebody, you have a keen teenager or somebody in the church says, look, I really want to know what it means. Well, let's sit down over a coffee and really wrestle through what the options are. For that individual, they may love that, but I can almost guarantee that you will lose people in the congregation if you give that to everybody. Developmental questions. This is another thing that, whether you're dealing with a complex passage or not, is a thing that's worth kind of being aware of as a preacher. I don't know if other teachers use different labels for this. Haddon Robinson talked about these as the developmental questions. And when I first heard this, I thought, I'm not convinced about that. And then very quickly, I became very convinced and thought, actually, that's really, really useful. So let me just share this with you. The kind of foundational statement for understanding developmental questions is that an idea can only be developed in 3 ways. That is, if somebody says something, there are essentially 3 questions to get them to say more about that, or they change subject. But if you change subject, you're not developing, you're moving on. And so example I tend to give would be something simple like, I hear the weather is going to be good tomorrow. I throw that out. That creates questions. You might say, what do you mean good? Do you mean like British good, or do you mean like Romanian good? Like define good. Or you might say, yeah, that's, I know what you mean, but how do you know it's going to be good tomorrow? Have you just got this, just a hunch, or have you seen a forecast? What's the source of your information? Tell me how you know that's true. Or you can ask a question like, so what? What are we supposed to do with that information? Are we going to have a game of football? Are we going to have a barbecue? What are you suggesting that we do? Get some vitamin D, protect our health a little bit. What is it that you're driving at? And essentially, all those different questions are 3 questions. They are either explain what you mean, or prove what you're saying, or apply what you're saying. And there's nothing else you can do to develop an idea. Now, the beautiful thing about that is once you start to recognize that, that becomes an incredibly useful tool to help you clarify both your exegesis and your preaching. So as you're developing your message, so for example, I don't use the language of illustrations, apart from the fact that I have to keep saying illustrations to show what I mean. But in the way I teach preaching, I don't say add illustrations to your message at this stage. I would rather say, what do you need to add to your message? If you've got your skeleton in place, you've got your outline, what's the flesh that's going to go onto the bone? How are you going to develop your point? Are you going to add explanation or proof or application? And by giving that specificity, it helps us to clarify what it is we're trying to say when we're preaching. Or to go back a step, it can help us as we're trying to exegete a passage to ask, what is the author doing here? Is Peter explaining? Is he proving? Or is he applying? Okay, so it's useful in our study, but it's also useful in our preaching. So, for example, going back to the first paragraph, if you were preaching this, let's say you've read it out. Let's imagine, for argument's sake, that the kind of point is what we've got there. Having said that, you've got a few minutes in your sermon. What's needed to develop at this point? Does this paragraph that we've got on the screen in front of us, does it need explaining? Does it need proving? Does it need applying? What do you need to do? And then once you know that, you can start thinking about what might actually help to achieve that. Any thoughts? What comes to mind here? Does this feel like a section that you should jump to applying, or should you do some explaining first? What's needed for a tip? I mean, this is very hypothetical, but for a typical congregation, your congregation, you've read this, you've set it up, you've introduced your message. What do you feel you're going to need to do with this bit of the text next? Our time's gone. Let me just share one thing just as we close. When you look at that paragraph there, I think there's some explanation that's needed before you can move on to proof. Often proof isn't needed for Christians, but sometimes it is. And then application. If we were looking at this one, I don't see how you can not do a lot of explanation. That's going to be an explanation heavy paragraph. And so your kind of applications, implications of it are going to be kind of succinct, because it's going to take a chunk of time to explain it, unless you're kind of swallowing it into a message with the previous paragraph. Take the last one as a sort of a contrast. There's not a lot of stuff that needs explaining there. Maybe little bits of explanation to make sure people get what you mean. What does it mean, covers a multitude of sins? Well, that could take 2 or 3 sentences and that could be clear. The end of all things, it's probably referring to the return of Christ. Okay, you can explain fairly briefly. If you've then got 10 minutes to encourage people to apply this, that's wonderful. Don't waste that 10 minutes explaining things that people already understand. Do you see what I'm saying? So explain, prove, apply, but only if necessary. All right. Explain as much as you need to, prove as much as you need to, apply as much as you can, but just make sure that application doesn't swallow the thrust of the passage pastorally or Christocentrically, right? It's pointing us to him, and the application is a response. Anyway, our time's gone. So let's take our break. Leave your camera on, or turn your camera off, but leave your link connected. We'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back for the last session in this sequence.